the Scarletlolo cooking show. Welcome.
Hello, I'm delighted to be able to make this presentation, not merely because I agree massively with the principles of the Lolo cooking show and my beautiful wife, of course, but many of the principles that she's expounding are firmly entrenched in physiology and pathology, which I have come to from over 40 years in laboratory and clinic working in NHS pathology. So, sugar first. As a species, we've evolved from creatures in Africa, ape-like creatures, that's undeniable, and up till possibly 100 or 200 years ago, we learned to survive mostly in times of scarcity. But the difficulty we now face is learning to survive in times of plenty. Over the millions of years, our bodies are programmed to save what it can when it can. And there's two good examples of that. First is iron, that we're not really interested in. Iron is a valuable resource and we store iron. But the second one is sugar. And by sugar, I mostly mean glucose, which is one of the two major sources of energy that our cells need in order to generate the energy that we need to live with. The second source of energy, curiously, is fat. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So, we eat glucose, great, we can do stuff with it. But if we eat and eat and eat and eat more glucose than we need, what do we do with it? We don't excrete it, we save it. Our bodies are programmed to save that glucose as glycogen. Glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrates. In plants it's starch, in animals it's glycogen. And we save an awful lot of glycogen in our liver, for example. But our liver and the rest of our bodies can only save so much glycogen. And when there's too much glycogen, when the storage of these forms have been filled up, we need to put that energy somewhere else. And the body is programmed to convert that glucose into fat. Now, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, fat can be good as a source of energy. And curiously, there is fat around our hearts. Even the healthiest people have fat around their heart. This can't possibly be a bad thing. There must be some good in having fat around the heart. And my colleagues believe this is because, in some cases, this fat around the heart can be a source of energy. So that's certainly a good thing to have. But fat elsewhere is storage. And as I said, we don't really need to store fat. We should really have our fat stores at a minimum, excuse me, because we store energy as glycogen and as glucose. Okay, so now we've done a little bit about glucose. The big question is, so what? And you are going to die. I absolutely guarantee it. And hopefully it will be a good death. But to some extent we can control how we get ill and how we die. And one of the ways is to not eat as much sugar as Lolo is trying to do. The reason is the D word. D for diabetes. So diabetes is a clinical situation where there's too much sugar in the blood. Too much sugar being eaten. Now where does that sugar go? Well, I've already said, hopefully quite a lot of it will go to the glycogen stores in our liver. But glucose also stays in the blood and it makes it sugary. So diabetes is a consequence of too much sugar in the blood. The posh word for which is hyperglycemia. Hyper, too much, glucose, emia, of the blood. So hyperglycemia is a key component of discovering whether or not someone has diabetes. But more crucially, not only if they have diabetes, it also shows if they're going to have diabetes. All this sugar in the blood gets into red blood cells and makes them sugarified. And this is how my colleagues in the laboratory measure the diabetes and the risk of diabetes by how much sugar there is inside red blood cells. So that's a blood test which is very easy to do. Type 1 diabetes. Now, have you ever done something foolish? Who hasn't? And unfortunately, many people's bodies do something foolish, and they foolishly make antibodies against themselves when they should be making antibodies against bacteria and viruses. And some people make antibodies against the cells that make insulin in the pancreas, a little organ here on the left. Now, when that pancreas gets destroyed, and it may be destroyed by a virus or by these antibodies, sugar control goes out the window, and the unfortunate person automatically becomes hyperglycemic. Ooh. Hyperglycemia, too much sugar in the blood. Unfortunately, that means the patient might need to take insulin by injections, but that's just something we have to get round somehow, and it's not really a key point of what I'm talking about. I'm moving straight to type 2 diabetes. Now, this is where there's been so much glucose in the blood for such a long time that the body's control of glucose is exhausted. It simply gives up. I can't do anything about this anymore. The glucose is here to stay. So the glucose just stays in the blood, sloshes around, and as I've said earlier, yes, it gets into red blood cells, but it gets into other places as well and causes various problems. Being of a certain age, I was surprised to learn that one of my favourite disc jockeys, John Peel, died like that of a heart attack because he was a diabetic. But let's get back to fat for a moment. In the first section, I talked about fat around the heart as a source of energy. Too much glucose in the blood ends up being converted into fat. Fat is a much easier way of carrying energy in many cases, and too much fat leads to overweight. So being overweight is a big risk factor for being a diabetic, and it works backwards as well. So diabetics can become overweight, and overweight people can become diabetic. But worse than that is obesity. And we have a spectrum of normal weight, middle and high. And this is characterized by something called the body mass index, or the BMI. So hopefully we all have a lowish body mass index. But as the body mass index gets bigger and bigger, bad things happen. And by bad things, I mean the risk of other disease. And these include cancer, osteoarthritis, and DVT, and many other things as well, including heart disease. So certainly, getting rid of sugar, keeping a low amount of sugar is good to avoid the hyperglycemia that could well lead to the many consequences of diabetes, such as eye disease. Retinopathy is a consequence of diabetes, and so are many other things that doctors are concerned about. Okay, well, I believe passionately in my vocation, and I've seen some horrible things in hospital. I just want to share with you a slide I use a lot in my teaching about diabetes. So this is clearly somebody's leg, and I like to use this because it gives me 3 things to talk about for the price of 1 slide. Firstly, right in the middle of the shin of this person with diabetes is a rather gruesome exposed ulcer. Now, this ulcer has come about because the blood vessels feeding this part of the leg have been destroyed by the disease process in diabetes, and the blood vessels can't provide the skin with the nutrients and the white blood cells to defend it from damage here. This damage allows in bacteria and viruses, and the whole area can be inflamed. And this is very difficult to heal because of the difficulty in bringing in all the good guys in the blood vessels. Second point are the toes. And if you've got good eyesight, you might notice that several of these toes are black. This is digital gangrene. The disease process has advanced in this patient's foot so that these toes are not getting the nutrients and the white cells that they need. So these 2 toes here have been attacked by the environment, by bacteria, by viruses. They've become cold and they're damaged. Sooner or later, if that progresses, then the toes will become necrotic That means they die and they'll have to be amputated. And diabetic foot is quite a big problem out there in diabetes land. Now, the third part is up here at the knee. And can you see that line over the knee? No, it's not drawn on biro, it's a scar. And that shows that they've had an artificial knee replacement. And the leading factor for joint replacement surgery such as this is osteoarthritis, is overweight. So overweight has come along with the diabetes in this patient to cause these three clinical problems: the venous ulcers, the gangrene, and the need for orthopedic surgery to replace damaged and worn out joints. So I've been talking at length about some horrible things, some bad things, and now some good things. Some good news is most of what I've been talking about is reversible. Now, by controlling glucose, we know that diabetes can be reversed, can be got rid of even, trying really, really hard to do so. But certainly, diabetics can help themselves by reducing their sugar, either by injections of insulin or with tablets. But a second aspect is coming back to what I was saying at the beginning about evolution. Evolution in the time of scarcity, it was a good thing to be thin and fit in escaping those big carnivores that want us for their breakfast. Darwin and the scientists that followed him coined expressions such as survival of the fittest. Now, fittest in that area is slightly different from what I'm going to be talking about. Here, I'm talking about cardiovascular fitness, which really boils down to the E word for exercise. Our Olympic athletes, for example, eat much more because they expend all that energy in food in whatever particular sport they're taking part in. So certainly, the low sugar way is great, but to balance that, we all recognize the value and importance of exercise. And certainly, it's great if you do cut down your sugar and your salt, but certainly exercise is the second part of avoiding hyperglycemia, and with it the diabetes, the overweight, and the obesity, which brings horrible consequences for those with those conditions. So that is just about it on the low sugar part. I'll next be doing the same kind of chat with low salt, which is another bad thing we need to address. Okay, see you later.
Give it a go with Lolo. When you subscribe, you can get notifications, so you'll know whenever there's a new show.